We need to talk. To what extent do classical and modern liberals agree on the economy? Now, this is one of those questions that you must be prepared for because it is entirely predictable. And I've probably made this point before in class, but to what extent does X agree on Y is like your bread and butter political ideas. So, for example, to what extent do conservatives agree? You got conservatives, so conservatism, socialism, liberalism, and then whatever your additional ideology is. So probably anarchism, and then you've got the four key ideas, which are economy, society, state, and human nature. And putting any of them in combination with any of them should almost be an expected question to come up. Now, they may not come up, in which case you'd be like, this is a waste of my time. But look back at all the past questions, and this kind of combination comes up a lot. So, for example, to what extent do conservatives agree about human nature? To what extent do socialists agree about society? Or to what extent do classic and modern liberals agree on the economy? You know, you should go through and do those essay plans for those, what would it be, 12 essays? Excuse me. Because they are probably some of the most likely and predictable ones to come up. Now, the other nice thing about this question is not only is it predictable, it's very, very straightforward and clear. There's no kind of words here to kind of trip you up. And it's very clear what it's about. Hopefully you very much understand the term economy. You will have looked at it in class. You'll have looked at it in your textbooks. You don't need to kind of think, well, you know, what is this question really asking me? There's no hidden traps. It is about as simple as it can get. But that doesn't make this question easy, and I'll explain why. Because the issue with this question is that it very much limits you to the economy. And to make this point, I'll just show you the question I was talking about in my previous video, which was this one. To what extent have modern liberals abandoned individualism and embraced collectivism? Now, at first glance, this is harder. You've got these unusual words, abandoned and embraced, and you then have to kind of think, so how does that fit into my understanding of the question? We aren't just talking about simple concepts like economy, human nature. We've got this core part of liberalism, which is individualism, and combining it with another term, which is collectivism. So this question requires more thought. But what this question allows you to do is when you're talking about individualism, you can think about human nature and its individualism. You can think about how that works in society. You can think about how that might work in the economy. You can think about how the state can actually kind of demonstrate this kind of collectivism or individualism. My point being, this question allows you to bring in huge amounts of what you have actually learned about liberalism. And if not all of the key thinkers, as long as you keep tying it back to individualism and collectivism and showing on which side of the debate it lies, this is a very broad question. And actually, the more you think about this one, and the more, and you're kind of doing your plan, it's one of those, sometimes you're kind of writing a plan and you're thinking, oh, well, what do I bring in next? But this is one of those plans where you kind of think, oh, and I can bring in this, and I can bring in this, and I can bring in this. But the problem with this question is we instantly go, cool, I understand this. We write our first paragraph and then go, oh, where do I go from here? And so the challenge with this question is having enough to say about the economy to get to our 24 marks. Or, as I'll try and talk about in this kind of essay plan, how do you bring in other things to tie it to the economy? And can you bring it in? So, for example, if you think, well, can I talk about human nature? You need to think, well, can I make human nature relevant to the economy? If you can, you can bring it in. If you can't, or it's dodgy, the examiner might kind of go, you know, that's not really relevant. So you have to make it relevant to the economy if it's going to fit this essay. So the question, as you can see, is agreement and disagreement. Now, one of the other things to talk about here is, and I realize I'm giving a lot of preamble, but it's important to understand what this question is asking us before we get into the detail of it, is it is not asking you what liberals think about the economy. So if I was to say to you, do you prefer Big Macs from McDonald's or Whoppers from Burger King? And then you started telling me in detail what a McDonald's Big Mac was. The information you're giving me is relevant, but you have not answered the question in any way, shape, or form. So if your essay goes through and kind of says, well, so this is what classic liberals think about the economy, and you kind of bring in some key thinkers, and they think this, and they think this. The question is saying, do they agree? So if you only talk about what they think with none of this kind of framing of agreement or disagreement, you will be losing huge amounts of marks in analysis and evaluation and only picking up some knowledge marks. So if your paragraphs don't begin and end with some sort of liberals agree about this, or most liberals agree about this, or it is possible to argue that there is disagreement about this, you are not answering this question. And look back at the essays you have written, look at some of the sample answers you've been kind of given, and pick out the ones that are doing it well and pick out the ones that are doing it badly. But the framing of each paragraph must be around agreement and disagreement, not about the economy. Because if you look at this question, and I was to say to you, at the end of the day, what is this question about? Is this question about the economy, or is this question about agreement and disagreement between liberals? It is the latter. It is about agreement and disagreement relating to the economy. Sure, still relevant. We can't forget the economy, but it is not just a question about the economy. And if you do that, you're going to fall into a trap. Which is why I'm framing this PowerPoint like this one. So what do liberals agree about when it comes to the economy? Well, they all believe in capitalism. Different forms of capitalism, but they all agree that we should have the right to earn private property, we should have the right to start businesses, we should have the right to kind of make the best for ourselves, that the things shouldn't kind of be state-owned. They believe that private property is a natural right. One of the key thinkers talks about that and expands upon those points. And looking at some essays in liberalism, one of the traps that people fall into when they look at a question like this is they focus purely on the disagreement. And they kind of say, well, classic liberals think this, but modern liberals think this, and that's kind of the pattern of their essay. They just talk about the disagreement, which is only half the essay. I mean, you might want to argue they disagree. Okay, fine. But unless you look at both sides, and you know this from other politics essays, you get capped. If you don't say there is agreement and there is disagreement, you get capped. Now, of course, you do need to make an argument. So remember, I've talked about this in previous essay videos. The trick with a politics essay is you need to present both sides, but you need to present one side to be like, this is a strong argument, and you need to present the other side to say, no, I disagree with this. So you must present agreement and disagreement, or you will get a terrible mark, to be blunt. So they agree in capitalism. They agree that private property is a natural right. They will all agree in individualism, and your kind of the idea that you can demonstrate that individualism through your own personal economic success or not, and you should be able to kind of carve out your own way rationally, choosing what it is you kind of want to do. They all agree that we should have a meritocracy. So when you're having the economy, it shouldn't just be like you're born rich or they shouldn't just say that like certain people have a right to be a rich ruling class and other people are kind of stuck in poverty. Think the old feudal system. Liberals do not agree that you are born into a particular social class, and that is that. They believe in a meritocracy where people can rise and fall based on their efforts and their abilities. And this is big. There is a lot to talk about here. There's at least 2 paragraphs worth of stuff there by the time you add in the key thinkers and discuss the implication of this and what that means, and perhaps even make, when you're talking about individualism, you could make some links to the human nature. When you're talking about meritocracy, you could perhaps bring in some links to kind of society, maybe the state. When you're talking about private property, you could definitely kind of bring in the state as well. Of course, linking everything always back to the economy, but it allows you to bring in more knowledge that you've got. What about disagreement? Well, this is where we start to have to kind of get into the nuts and nitty-gritty of it. So although they both agree in capitalism, classic liberals believe in a kind of laissez-faire style economy with this kind of invisible guiding hand, which the Adam Smith style of economics believes exists. Whereas the modern liberals would argue that markets are not self-regulating, and therefore they can lead to crashes and the exploitation of the poor, and therefore it needs some form of state intervention like this, where we have a kind of a state-directed economy where there is regulated demand for sustainable growth and full employment. So this idea, the comparison here being, think Keynesian-style economics versus those totally free markets. Modern liberals onto the side of the kind of the directed economy, maybe even a mixed economy, where you have a mixture of private, public businesses or industries. Laissez-faire being making the state as small as possible when it comes to the economy, and that then also goes to this idea of trickle-down approach. So classic liberals believe that poorer people will benefit because money will kind of trickle down through a free economy, because people will start their businesses, they'll employ poorer people, so the money will kind of trickle down and the economy will kind of will right itself. I think it was Ronald Reagan in particular used to talk about trickle-down economics, which is the idea that you free the markets and the markets eventually will support everyone through free markets. Whereas modern liberals will say, no, this leads to exploitation. Look at the what's happened in kind of factories. I mean, you can give examples. You can bring in examples in a political ideas essay. You can talk about the financial crash of 2008. You can talk about exploitation of Amazon workers in factories or whatever it might be, whatever current scandal is in the news. And so, modern liberals would say, no, there needs to be some sort of state intervention here. Let me just move myself to one side. Modern liberals would also argue that an unregulated market can cause social problems and prevent equality of opportunity. So I'm not quite sure where to put myself, so I'll put myself down there. Think about John Rawls and his veil of ignorance and his equality of opportunity. A modern liberal would argue that a completely free market, a completely free economy does not give equal opportunity to everyone, and therefore we should have some sort of redistribution of wealth. Again, I'm linking everything back to economic ideas here, but classic liberals would then argue that redistribution of wealth is incompatible with individualism, it's incompatible with freedom. If the government comes along, takes a load of your money to give it to someone else, then how free are you? So we've got some big disagreements here. So your question then is, now you know what you need to talk about, is you need to decide, what happened there? Oh yeah, so private versus mixed economy, which I already kind of mentioned as well. You know, are there any state-owned industries, or is there none, or is it just limited to something like the NHS, or are the industries, the transports, the energy industries, the post office, are they owned by the state as a form of service, perhaps? So then I'll come to that link in a second, because I've got a nice link where you can see some of this kind of written out. The question is then, is there more agreement, or is there more disagreement? Because again, the question is not just what are the agreements and what are the disagreements. If that was the case, you'd pick up your knowledge and perhaps some analysis, but now you need to say, well, you know, do liberals basically agree, or do they basically disagree about the economy? And you need to make a decision. So this is a straightforward, do they agree or disagree, more debate. And so before you start writing it, you need to come down and you need to decide on which way you're going to argue. Do they fundamentally agree? Is there more of these, or is there more of these? And I don't just mean counting them in terms of numbers, but, you know, are these the more important core similarities, or are these the more important core differences? For this essay, I think you could go either way. Like in some essays, I would kind of push you to say, look, I think this is an easier argument to make or a stronger argument to make. For this essay, you can see that there's strong arguments on both sides there. You just need to pick a side and go with it. How are you going to structure this? Well, the not great structure, but it works, is basically to structure it like I just did this video. You could say, well, here are the agreements, here are the disagreements, but then you need a big section that then compares those two and talks about, well, are there more similarities or are there more disagreements? This works, it's straightforward, but that analysis section at the end is really, really important. Or you could do it by themes, perhaps. You could have a section where you talk about capitalism and its various forms, and then kind of show how modern and classic liberals agree and disagree about that. So this section here about capitalism and its forms would have to have an agreement section and a disagreement section, whichever way round you want to go. And then perhaps a section on redistribution of wealth. And then again, you can talk about agreements and you can talk about disagreements, and or the other way around. For those of you who I teach, if I say to you, build up a wall and knock it down, you know what I'm talking about with an essay structure. You could start off, so supposing your essay wants to argue that they fundamentally disagree, you could say, well, it is possible to argue that classic liberals agree about capitalism. They all agree with capitalism. They all agree that private property is a natural right. Key thinkers. However, when it comes down to it, ultimately this is flawed because they agree. They actually believe in different forms of capitalism. For example, modern liberals agree in the Keynesian form of economics, blah, 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 and off you go. So you can set up one argument and then counter it with your personal strongest one. But ultimately, go with the structure you feel more comfortable with. But I prefer the second. So hopefully that tells you all the things that you could bring into this essay. But just to show you a kind of example, and I'll try and put the link to this in the description. I'll bring this across. There's a website here called ukessays.com, and it goes through, this is just classic and modern liberalism, and it's just kind of an essay writing tool. And it's actually just about classic liberalism in general, but it has some really, really nice sections here that are related to the economy. So, and obviously you can't copy things, but you can see how these things are written out. Another crucial element of classic liberalism is economic liberalism. This principle was mostly provided by Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. In a word, classic liberals advocate laissez-faire, believing in the self-regulating of the market, the minimum of government intervention, which guarantees liberty of individuals and the prosperity of the market. Then it goes into other topics. And then when it comes back down to here, especially from this section here, modern liberalism, it then brings in an alternative. Problems in the free market economy. So it explains why, not just what modern liberals think, but why modern liberals think it. Brilliant. Consequence between rich and poor, talks about here about reforms, and then it kind of goes on to poverty and hunger, of course, which are related to the economy and things like that. Talks about industrialization, and talks about welfare programs and things like that. And then it goes into the visible hand of the government and things like that. So I'll put that link into the description. It is not just an essay on the economy, but there's a couple of paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs, where you can go, okay, that's a really nice way of explaining those particular concepts, and you can see how it works. If you liked this video, then don't forget to like it. I hope it will help you with your essays in the future, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.